this is from the book that I've been reading and will continue to read today. And that book title is The History of Ancient America Anterior to the Time of Columbus, Proving the Identity of the Aborigines with the Tyrians and Israelites by George Jones, written between the dates of 1810 and 1879. Let's move forward. Chapter 13, 332 BC, the first migration across the Atlantic Ocean and the landing of the Tyrians upon the Western Hemisphere, and now 2,175 years since, and consequently 1824 years before the rediscovery by Columbus, the fulfillment of the seventh and last Tyrian prophecy by Isaiah. Section 1, quote, the means and appliances, unquote, for the voyage. In the endeavor to establish the first, my eyes just go off to something else. In the endeavor to establish the fact contemplated by the title of this chapter, it will be necessary to bring to the memory of the leader mm, oh my goodness, let me start over. In the endeavor to establish the fact contemplated the title of this chapter, it will be necessary to bring to the memory of the reader some of the material points having reference to the voyage around the continent of Africa. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 6, Paragraph 2. Other points of proof will be given and for convenience in numerical order. First, the galleys. The larger galleys were double-masted, and they had not only the large square sails, which were exactly suited for running before the wind from their central and balanced position, but they had also the powerful adjunct of the rowers whose services were rendered with or without reference to the assistance of the sails. The extraordinary power of the rowers is recorded by nearly every ancient historian, and from scripture we have the character of their strength and fearlessness, especially of the Tyrians. Ezekiel writes in his description of Tyrus, quote, and that and thy rowers have brought thee into great waters, unquote. Fitness of the capacity of the galleys will not be questioned. When thought is given to the previous expedition around Africa, and especially at the doubling of the Cape of Good Hope, which is far more dangerous than crossing the Atlantic. Second, The locality of the fortunate owl, in other words, Canaries, this is important. These are situated on the northwest coast of Africa in the Atlantic Ocean and within 30 degrees of north latitude, and consequently directly under the influence of the celebrated easterly wind. Third, the east wind is proof of the truth of history. The reader will remember the detailed account given of this constant current of air in the sixth chapter of this book, Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 6, Paragraph 2. We may, however, be permitted to repeat that it blows perpetually from east to west, consequently over and from the Fortunate Isles directly towards America, those islands being within the degrees over which this orient gale has and will forever pass. The direct opposite land to these islands on the American continent is Florida, it being, like the Isles, within the 30 degrees north latitude. Now, any vessel or galley to set sail before the wind from Tenerife, the isle upon which the Tyrians were, and place the rudder or helm fore and aft, in other words, not obliquely, central, then the east wind would drive that vessel directly on to Florida. This fact is not more certain, as the map will prove, than the historical tradition of the Mexican Aborigines is extraordinary in reference to this fact and to the original theory forming the basis of this volume. We stated in the analogies, and it is now repeated with peculiar force and interest, that the Spanish historian Sahagan, who lived on friendly terms with the Aborigines for 60 years and wrote only 15 years after the Cortesian conquest, 1520, relates that on the authority of Montezuma, the emperor, and his people, and the tradition from the remotest times handed down from sire to son, and also from their historical paintings, that their ancestors as a colony first touched at Florida, that they crossed or coasted the Gulf of Mexico and Yucatan, and then finally landed and settled somewhere in the Bay of Honduras. Now, the Copan River is a branch of the Montugue, which empties itself into the Bay of Honduras. The reader will not be more startled at the above historic facts than was the present author at their discovery, for he had already formed in his mind, sanctioned by prophecy, the Tyrian era of this history before his research brought to light his direct evidence from Sahagan, whose accuracy of relation is, in this instance, on a level with Herodotus, for both accounts are proved to be true by that powerful and incorruptible witness, nature. The shadow of the Tyrians, as a necessity, changed from left to right in crossing the equatorial line of the Indian Ocean, and the east wind would compel the galleys in coming from quote, the east, unquote, and upon sailing due west from Tenerife to, quote, touch at Florida, unquote. The statement of Sahagan is the more valuable from the fact that it was not given to establish or forward any historic theory, but like the words of Herodotus, giving only as a truth, related by those of whom he was writing. Quote, somewhere in the Bay of Honduras, unquote, brings the final place of landing, as stated, near the locality of Copan. We had already, from analyzing the ruins and altar, placed that city in our plan as being the first built in ancient America. It was an additional source of confirmation to our artistical judgment in regard to the arrangement of the architectural data of the ruins, when the tradition of the Aborigines, as given by Sahagan, was that their ancestors finally landed, quote, in the Bay of Honduras, unquote, and consequently on passing up the Montagua, the Tyrians would approach to the direct locality of Copan. Taking the statement of the Spaniard, therefore, to be a fact, sustained as it is by nature, in relation to the place first landed on or, quote, touched, unquote, by the Aborigines, viz., Florida. Another strange incident is arrived at, viz., that Columbus must have followed nearly the identical track of the Tyrians, for the same east wind propelled his vessels, and himself and crew expressed their wonder and astonishment at its continuance, and it is an authenticated fact that he first landed at St. Salvador, in other words, Cat Island. Now, the Fortunate Isles, St. Salvador, and the first point, quote, touched at Florida, unquote, quote, are all within 30 degrees north latitude and nearly on an exact line with each other. St. Salvador and Florida Point are directly so, and only about 100 leagues from each other. The Tyrians therefore passed by this island and landed on the continent. Columbus landed on the island and reached the continent in his third voyage. Fourth, the collective means for the migration. Under this head may be included the quote appliances unquote of both art and nature. Their galleys were of sufficient strength and capacity, their provisions ample, derived from Carthage, the Sidonians, and the fruitful Isle of Tenerife. Their skill and courage as pilots, mariners, and rowers unequaled, the season of the year propitious, and constantly favorable wind. And flowing sea, although to them unknown as such, of sufficient power to drive them quickly westward and compel them to reach the quote afar off unquote land quote to sojourn unquote. Fifth, the probable time and duration of the voyage. The remnant of the Tyrian nation, through the instrumentality of the sons of Dawn, escaped from their flaming capital August 20th, 332 BC. And in allowing for time in reaching the fortunate owls and preparing for their departure thence, it will, we think, be acceded that by October of the same year, and the equinoctial gales of the autumn having then passed, open to them, quote, fair weather ahead, unquote. They were then prepared to seek another home, however distant. The strong galleys with sails and oars, and always before the constant east wind and onward wave current, would accomplish 10 miles an hour by day, and during the night, without the roars, 6 miles an hour, and equally dividing the 24 hours would make a run of 192 miles per day. Nautical proofs will shew that in the above calculation, the power of the trade winds, in other words, the east winds, are underrated. The distance from Tenerife to Florida is about 3,300 miles, which by the foregone data, they would traverse in 17 and a quarter days. The voyage may therefore with safety be said to have been accomplished during an entire month, and that consequently the first landing of a branch of the human family in ancient America would be in the last month of autumn, 332 years before the Christian era. And sixth, the fugitive founders of what we think may now be justly termed Tyrian America, in other words, the southern moiety of the continent. The female portion of the fugitives were in all probability from the peculiar character of the rescue. The wives, sisters, and daughters of the Tyrian husbands, brothers, and fathers who escaped with them, thus forming a quote colony unquote. And if there were among them any strangers or orphans from the general carnage, protection would naturally be given. As to companions and children of misery and misfortune, the fugitives being Tyrians and of the great Sidonian family, which, in the language of Homer, comprehended everything that was ingenious and accomplished to the exclusion of their opposites, puts us at once in possession of the distinct intellectual character of those about to seek another land, and where, after 2,000 years have passed, time removes his veil of mystery and discovers the truth of the Homeric tribute, while over their Asiatic home of a more ancient day, oblivion with her Lethean flood has swept even their epitaph and their tomb away. As to the number of the Tyrian fugitives, more or less, it is immaterial to the proof or denial of the truth of this historical work. For nothing is so deceptive and yet so certain as the numerical demonstration in regard to population and of the human beings that have lived. For instance, the reader will scarcely believe that in tracing back his own family, only 25 generations, there were then living at that time 67 millions. 67 million blacks, aborigines, indigenous, who were later called Indians, and blacks, colors, mulattoes, Afro Americans, African Americans. I'm going to reread that again. For instance, the reader will scarcely believe that in tracing back his own family, only 25 generations, there were then living at that time 67 millions 108,864 of his ancestors, and that there had lived during and at that time 100 millions 663,396. These apparent incredible results are instantly proved upon the following data of facts and argument, viz. Each child must have two parents. Each parent had two, and so on ad infinitum. The result is, therefore, obtained by simply multiplying by 2 from each of the first father and mother, and then add them together, and each sum total will represent a generation. The 25th will give the first result. This 67,108,864. To ascertain all that have lived during and at that period, the several sums total must be added together, which will prove the second result, viz. 100,663,396, which will prove the second result. Correction. Therefore, by the data of this last calculation, the 30th generation only in the ancestral line has the following result: 3,221,228,672. And this but of one person, 4 times as much as the present population of the globe, which is estimated at 800 million. The great earthly monarch, Death, has indeed an empire of his own. I'm telling you, I'm really having a powerful moment, and tears come to my eyes knowing that someone left this roadmap behind for our ancestors. And a lot of stuff has been destroyed, and people intentionally targeted and disliked based on the color of their skin. You had people in Belize and Honduras that are brown skin, darker than light skin, not mixed with a European. And they are still to this day having issues with race. I'm not sure if I mentioned Brazil, Definitely can't forget America, Africa, I mean, the North America, the African Americans, quote, African Americans. So when I say African American, don't think that I agree with the term because I understand exactly what has happened throughout our time and our history. I understand it totally. Let me continue. The metaphysical or anti biblical reader will find in the above results a high theme for speculative reasoning, but in tracing back to parents of Eden or to the Diluvian era in order to sustain and not deny the truth of the Bible. He must remember that, but no, we will not anticipate our own secret for unraveling the above sphinx like conclusions. In the next volume, devoted to the Israel era, the subject will be investigated with that due consideration with every proposition demands having an apparent tendency to question the truth and authority of Scripture. Section 2. The voyage and landing in ancient America. The means employed to conceal their discovery from the Asiatics and Europeans, the building of the first altar, and the prophecies. We wish distinctly to be understood that we do not state or even infer that in the intended voyage the Tyrians had any positive pre knowledge of the existence of a Western continent. But this we do believe that from their knowledge of astronomy, they may have had the supposition that such might be the case. I don't want to interrupt this reading, but I'm going to. In the King James Version and the translated versions or study guides, it points out to us not to study astronomy. That is wicked. Not to worship it, but we're supposed to have knowledge of it, which is why we have a King James version and translation. So when you do open up a book and read it, you're not going to interpret. They're going to give you the perspective and control the narrative. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because when I read it from a kid to as an adult, from chapter to chapter, actually to start over, word by word, line by line, chapter by chapter, cover to cover, with a study guide, totally rejecting at least 24 years ago, referring to astronomy or to someone's zodiac. When our ancestors used the knowledge of astronomy to navigate. Let me continue. But this we do believe, that from their knowledge of astronomy, they may have had the supposition that such might be the case. The black race is a powerful race. The lineage of Judah is a powerful race. And just to think about all of the everything that the black woman goes through, or the black man goes through, or the black child goes through. This is blowing my mind reading this, even though there's only 3 more chapters left. They have they may have had the supposition that such might be the case from the then known globular character of the earth, and in their desperate situation they must have felt the sentiment of the African prince, who to his favorite, in reflecting upon the deaths that threatened them, exclaimed in consolation, quote, "Whatever world we are next thrown upon, it cannot be worse than this." Unquote. With the same feeling, in the second month of autumn, following the last summer of their country's fate, they gathered all on board, lowered sail, and dipped their oars. They paused only to cast their straining gaze upon the horizoned sons of Sidon, now about to be lost forever from their sight. For the solitary uh, and homebound bark, with clewed up sail and propelled by oar alone, for the eastern wind would oppose their return, seemed but a darkened speck upon the distant circle of the sea. The same wind opposed to the Sidonians' return now filled the Tyrian sails, and bore their galleys from that isle, an emblem of human life, where the tints of spring, summer, and autumn ever reign, and winter, where his snow-crowned peak rises above them all. Being borne on westward by the constant current of wind and wave, and without an effort of their own, and ignorant of the cause, they experienced only the effects, and yet their speed perceptible from the gradual sinking of the island base, they must have felt the same sentiment as subsequently Columbus did, and upon the identical Via Aquea, that the great guardian of a good cause must have issued his mandate for their especial or especial advancement and protection. Upon leaving the seasons, the Tyrian pilots would naturally obey the direction of the friendly breeze, and head their galleys in accordance with it. And this would be the more pleasing, as in their minds it would appear ominous of their future safety, for it would direct them daily towards the setting sun, the visible god of their religion, and therefore, as a consequence, in the direct track for the Western Hemisphere. The ocean titan of the silver crowned Tenerife, gradually falling beneath the horizon of the east, would suggest to the quote unquote wise man of the galleys to note his bearing with the stars of night, that the astral chart might guide them for a return voyage should their expedition be prolonged beyond their means of sustenance. For amid all the desolation, misery, and ruin of their country, in which the savage conqueror reveled during his slaughter banquet, although he triumphed over the dead, he could not destroy the visionary minds of the living. Their knowledge of astronomy made each rescued Tyrian a prophet of the deep. God's handwriting on the wall of heaven, where the dazzling stars are his letters, was read correctly by these ocean Daniels of Tyrus. That nation was indeed like ancient Babylon, numbered and finished, weighed in the balances and found wanting, and the kingdom divided and given to the conqueror, for her fate was sealed. And the Macedonian signet, whose owner solved the Gordian problem by the sword alone. Quote, Mene mene, tekel upharsin, upharsin, unquote. Apparently not only to the chief son of Babylon, the quote daughter of Sidon unquote had it branded on her brow, and in vain she wandered through her streets, striking with trembling fingers the loosened chords of once loved harp, to remind the passer-by of her former beauties. The diapason of her heart could never more awaken an echo, for God has spoken to the sea queen. Quote, I will cause the noise of thy songs to cease, and the sound of thy harps shall be more heard. Unquote. But the Chaldean language of the skies was not learnt by her Daniels in vain. It had taught them in a former age to guide their bold prows from Pharaoh's fatal sea, and coasting around all Afric's burning land, enabled them to pass the Herculean boundary pillars and so homeward to the Nile and Tigris, which are 2 score moons, received them. And now, when the remorseless conqueror, not science, drove their descendants forth upon quote, great waters, unquote, where, quote, the east wind could have broken them in the midst of the seas, unquote. That constant gale from the Orient Point created with time and will only cease with his decay, that earth circling and never varying gale from east to west, as if to compel discovery of the other hemisphere, and thence praise the works of God. That onward breeze, which alone routed the bold general seas and turned the reported vision to the reality. When the Tyrian sons were again upon these seas, but now before that orient gale, still the star tracery on the azure wall of the eternal dome, and the Apollo daily sinking on his western couch, and his last glance beckoning them, as it were, still to follow on his path. This knowledge and their religious adoration directed them in safety to that virgin land, where the glorious sun from creation's dawn had never beamed upon a human footprint until their own had kissed the untouched Floridian shore. There, Flora and her attendant nymphs, and all their peerless beauty and nature's own attire, were grouped on every hill, from their colored lips smiling welcome breath forth her ceaseless incense from every mound and valley, which raft on Zephyr's wings, enwrapped with health and gladness the approaching sons and daughters of a distant sea, whose wild songs of praise to gorgeous Apollo were borne by their orient and faithful envoy to the wave-clad shore, echo caught the subduing chorus of the heart, and bore it to her favorite haunt in mountain or in cave. The human voice, now first heard, aroused the reposing animals from glade and glen. The feathery tribes, in all their rainbow-tinted plumage, arose high in air, played their circles, and rested, music breathing, on "the fruit tree tops," as in the day of innocence, to receive their names from the Adams and the Eves of a new-found Eden in another hemisphere. They arrived in joyous gladness, and welcomed by all the gifts of nature, like an heir to sudden fortune, uncertain where to rest. The Tyrian left the shore of Florida and coasted the Gulf of Mexico, and so around the peninsula of Yucatan and into the Bay of Honduras. They thence ascended a river of shelter and safety, and above the rapids of which they selected the site of their first city, now occupied by ruins, altars, idols, and walls of Copan. After their first sacrifice to Apollo, they would naturally erect a chief altar, around which the Tyrian pilgrims who had come from "afar off to sojourn" might gather in remembrance of the vile act from Sidonian friendship. As we firmly believe, so we repeat the belief that the sculpture of the chief altar of Copan, as seen at this day, portrays from the hands of national gratitude a religious tribute to Sidon, who, amid the desolating hurricane, has safely gathered the human "gleanings" from the last field of their ill-fated country, who had lifted up her prostrate "daughter," and given her renewed strength and power, whereby "her own feet could carry her afar off to sojourn." Unquote. Another altar, sacred to Apollo, would be erected to that heavenly science, the knowledge of which had aided them over their watery track in safety and to freedom. Their children would fail not to cherish the altar fire of astronomy, the flame of which has, to the human eye, not only illuminated the earth, but unfolded the mechanisms of the heavens. It became the ever-burning lantern to their feet, until they could trace in sculpture the annual glory of that refulgent orb, which in their fatherland had been for a century of ages the divine emblem of their religion and their God. Footnote: sculpture found in buried ruins in Mexico, in other words, the calendar mentioned by Baron Humboldt. In preserving the secret of their discovery, their ancient precept, there was one incident only to be dreaded, and that was the possibility at a future day of a portion of the colony becoming disaffected and thereupon resolving to return to the fortunate owl, and so betray them. There was but one way to prevent this, and that was by the destruction of their galleys. And added to this, the passing of a law that no others should be built, and for the same reason. If this did take place, as we believe it did, the cause is instantly apparent why their newfound continent was for so many centuries unknown to Asiatics or Europeans. And it should be remembered, I'm going to repeat that. If this did take place as we believe it did, the cause is instantly apparent why their newfound continent, America, including Central, South, and North America, was for so many centuries, 1 century is 50 years, was for so many centuries unknown to Asiatics. That means Mongolians, the Orients, the Mongolians, the Siberians, or Europeans. That includes Spaniards, British, Polish, Czechoslovakians, etc. And it should be remembered that the east wind, which, like a friend, had wafted them to that continent, would oppose as an enemy any return from whence they came. Another cause may have led them to destroy their vessels. This, a religious offering to Apollo, and consequently fire would be the instrument of sacrifice. It would be their first thought upon a final landing, to present to their deity the most precious offering in their possession. And what had they so inestimable in value as the very means whereby their lives had been rescued? And having made that sacrifice to Apollo, fanatical zeal may have led them to abhor the future use of means which, as a grateful offering, had been given to their deity. Thence may be traced the gradual loss of nautical practice on an enlarged scale, and the great continent now possessed by them will also diminish by degrees the use of navigation, which means that the blacks, the now blacks ancestors were nautical. They swimmed. Everything that every stereotype that can be mentioned are nothing but lies. They are nothing but lies. We are a great people. The destruction of a fleet to prevent the return of followers was actually practiced by Cortez, the conqueror of the descendants of these Tyrians, and in the Gulf of Mexico. He may have received from tradition in the country that such an act had been accomplished by their aboriginal ancestors, and when he repeated the device and for a similar purpose, he would, for the sake of his own fame, conceal the secret of his intelligence. Oh, wow. And thereby increase his character for dauntless resolution. The Tyrians may have obtained their idea from the act of Alexander of Macedon, who, only 3 years anterior to their landing in ancient America, dismissed his fleet before the great battle with the Persians at Issus, that his troops should have no nautical means of returning, which means they destroyed their boats by means of sacrifice. They sent a burnt offering. Scripture reads about incense and flowers and sending up sweet smells as offerings. Incense are mentioned in Scripture. We conclude this chapter with the following solemn belief, founded upon years of study and reflection. This, as truly as a man in Europe or North America, when he gazes upon the sun's rising, will have his shadow fall from his left side, or if in Southern Africa or South America, and in so looking at the orb of day, that his shadow must fall from his right side. So truly do we believe, and with humility we write, and in hope of divine pardon, if in error, that the 5 additional prophecies by Isaiah have been justly, though newly, applied by us to the fate of the daughter of Sodom, especially the final one to the last of the Tyrians rescued by the Sidonians at the Alexandrian siege, and that the entire fulfillment of the great prophecy was accomplished by their landing and remaining on the western hemisphere. Quote, her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn, unquote. And that event took place 336 years before the birth of that Savior, whose advent was especially foretold by the same prophet. And all those missionaries that came over from the beginning knew, those keepers of records that started on the East Coast and went west and began creating their own scriptures. I remember 20 years ago that this religious group, specifically said they spoke of their disdain for the black race, calling them names, saying that they were lazy, that they were nothing, which means that they all knew from the beginning and came up with all these stereotypes. The continuous systematic racism. And systematic racism is when you take your power and you take away someone else's power, and you control the outcome of hiring and firing. You control the outcome of food. You control the outcome of education. You control the outcome of taxes. You control the outcome of redlining. You control the outcome of communities and what goes in and out of them, who gets to sell in them, who gets to buy houses, and who gets to keep the houses. We allow houses to be paid for, but then you can lose them by taxes. If you're not making the money and you're not getting hired, how can you keep the house? If you hire me at 20,000 a year, but you hire someone else at 100,000 a year, and please don't come at me talking about some get a education. We're talking facts here. This happens this way every day. There are people with degrees that get hired less. Their salary or their wages are less than someone else that does not mirror their skin color. So what do you do at your when you're leaving the earth while you're in your bed and you're about to leave the earth? Then you ask for forgiveness for all that you've done. Some of these people have a lot of nerve and they know. I'm going to reread that paragraph again before I close this chapter. Quote, her own feet shall carry her afar off to sojourn, unquote. And that event took place 332 years before the birth of that Savior, whose advent was especially foretold by the same prophet. That will conclude the reading of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Review of the Tyrian era, or the first epoch in the present original history of the ancient America and the evidences to sustain it. In summing up a case to the jury, it is generally understood that both plaintiff and defendant have been heard, and especially that the witnesses have been cross-examined. In assuming, therefore, our present position in regard to the summary of evidence, we have endeavored throughout this historic cause not only to be plaintiff for the history, but have also in many places been defendant and cross-examined our own points and witnesses, and even ourselves. In order to anticipate and answer demurs or objections, whether any apparent objections yet remain, and if some, and if so, whether they have been sufficiently overruled by the arguments, is for the jury, in other words, the public, to decide, and whether the verdict be in the affirmative for the plaintiff or in the negative, we shall receive the announcement from the foreman, in other words, the press, with perfect acquiescence in his judgment. And while our blood nature will not permit a cringing of the knee for favor or for flattery, yet we ask and expect from that intellectual foreman, whose voice is now potential with the jury, that liberal justice which he knows so well how to dispense, and especially in a novel case, novel, comprehending so enlarged a field of original argument, reasoning, and resources as the present one, to establish that the Aborigines of South and Central, in other words, Mexican America, were from the last of the Tyrian family in Asia. The following arguments, meaning, if you wasn't here from the beginning of the other readings, do not think that he's saying that Mexico or South and Central America was first inhabited by Mexicans. This is not true. Therefore, you have to listen to the beginning recordings of this playlist. I will not point it out. I'm going to begin reading again. To establish that the Aborigines of South and Central, in other words, Mexican America, were from the last of the Tyrian family in Asia. The following arguments and evidences have been produced. This: the separation of the Aborigines of the Western Hemisphere in two distinct races or people, and that division justified by absolute contrast in their moral and physical condition and manners, in their political and religious customs and observances. And in addition to these powerful contrasts is the fact that North America possesses no architectural stone ruins, while in the Mexican portion of the continent, many cities and temples have been found. Two different people. The Mexicans originally were black until the Spaniards, and the Asiatics, Mongolians came and mated with them. While in the Mexican portion of the continent, many cities and temples have been found. The great and injurious error of naming the Aborigines, quote, Indians, unquote, was pointed out, as well as the author and the cause of the misnomer and its effects. The title of the first epoch was then given, and the arrangement of the several propositions for establishing its truth. An elaborate argument was next founded upon the important and interesting question, quote, are the fine arts of sufficient authority to be received in evidence for establishing historical records or events, unquote. Having produced an answer, Connor Moore, and especially illustrated the answer, and con amor means with love. By the resuscitation of the ruins of Rome, we proceeded in the belief that the argument was conclusive and in the affirmative. The fact was then established of the discovery of the ancient ruins in Southern or Central America, viz., at Mitla, Cholula, Oxmo, Palenque, Quewingua, Ocosingo, Tecpan, Guatemala, Guaguatianago, Quicheche, Copan, Chichen, Zayi, Zaba, Espida, Tico, and Labna. And these severally, upon the high authority of the justly renowned Humboldt, the Spanish commissioners, Del Rio and Waldeck, Dupe and Galindo, and last, not least, the enterprising American traveler, Stevens, and his artist associate, Catherwood, and to which list may now be added the name of Norman. Stevens has investigated other ruins in Yucatan, but they are precisely analogous to that of Oxmo. Reference was then made to the Mexican paintings preserved in the Vatican, Bologna, and Madrid, and republished in the folio volumes by Lord Kingsborough. Abstracts followed from the descriptions of the ruins of Copan, Palenque, and Oxmo, with such commentaries as were required for illustration of the architecture and sculpture or for detecting errors. A critical analysis was then presented of the conclusions arrived at by Stevens in reference to the architecture and of the nations rejected by him as the builders. His errors were shewn by his own contradictions, and the basis of his argument being founded upon those errors. The conclusions, as a necessity, fell to the ground, for it was shewn that the only nation or people that could claim to be the architects and having means to reach the continent were not so much as mentioned by him, and consequently not investigated. If he had done so, it would instantly have interfered with a favorite conclusion which he was determined to arrive at, if not by artistical and scientific reasoning, at least by one of the noblest traits in the human character, viz., love of country. This was so pardonable in a book merely of incidents of travel that while it could not deprive honest criticism of exposing the sophistry, it at once, from pure sympathy in the sentiment, withheld the shaft of condemnation. We then proceeded to prove, upon the direct rules of art, that the pyramidal ruins forming basis for receiving, and with the peculiar superstructures on them, that they were only traceable as Egypto-Tyrian architecture, that the sculpture aided this conclusion, and finally established the nation to be Tyrians, from recording the celebrated worship of Saturn, the victim-craving Moloch of Canaan's descendants. A no less strong than interesting proof we submit was brought to the consideration of the reader in the general identity between Solomon's Temple of Jerusalem, built by Tyrians, and the temples of Palenque and Copan. A convincing catalog of analogies was then produced, establishing directly establishing direct identity between the ancient Tyrians and Mexicans, even as to the manner of disposing of the unalived, as illustrated in the discovered mummies of the two nations. To which proofs were added the historical traditions of the Aborigines as to where they came from, viz., quote, the East, unquote, the place where they first landed, viz., quote, first touched at Florida, unquote, and the period of their arrival, viz., quote, before the Christian era, unquote. Mr. Stevens' second visit to Yucatan was alluded to, and it was shown that the additional discoveries did not only not oppose this history, but on the contrary, actually supported it. In support of their own assertions of having reached the continent by means of navigation, it was then stated, upon the authority of the Spanish historian Sahagun, that they produced to Cortes maps and charts of the Bay of Honduras, and so accurate were they from ancient times, that the Spanish conqueror was saved from wreck during a perilous voyage in those seas by following their direction. The remains of an ancient galley were mentioned as having been found, deeply embedded in the sands of the eastern or Atlantic shore of South America, and this was given upon good authority. These facts, analogies, and traditions naturally turn the mind to a nation having the quote means and appliances unquote to reach the Western Hemisphere at so early a period as that contemplated by the antiquity of the ruins or the ancient days in which the traditions originated, and having already established the builders from the architecture and analogues, and analogies to be Tyrian. It was with similar pleasure when we found that the nautical investigation enabled it compelled us to arrive at the same conclusion. Tyrus, therefore, being as it were the founder of ancient America, called for her antecedent history. Commencing with a review of the Phoenician nations generally, we proceeded to give the history of the chief events of Tyrus, analyzing the romance and spirit of the Tyrian people, unfolding her ill-directed commercial policy and monopoly, tracing her rise and fall to their causes, and thus removed the wonder created by contemplating the terrible but certain effects. This, we humbly consider, is the only true philosophy of history. As we dwelt upon the reign of Hiram the Great, with that pleasure arising from delineating the blessings of peace and the progress of the arts, so we were elaborate in our description of the siege and fall of Tyrus, through the invasion by Alexander of Macedon, that the horrors and curses of war and the destruction of civilization should be the more forcibly estimated by contrast. That invaders or conquerors should receive the scorn and curse they deserve. Patriots and peacemakers the praise and blessings they merit and must receive from God and man. Our history of the Tyrian nation is indeed but a picture of the past, yet we shall dare hope that it contains no useless record, but that in each event delineated may be seen the secret lesson for the present and the future. In Chapter 6, Volume 1, Book 2 was investigated the first circumnavigation of the African continent by the Tyrians, and we respectfully submit that it was established to have been accomplished and that the Fortunate Isles were discovered during voyage. The means possessed at that time for such an exposition or any other were detailed, as also especially the causes, effects, and locality of the east wind of scriptural language and its influences in propelling or opposing vessels to or from the western continent. Having identified the builders of the ancient cities from the architecture, analogies, and traditions to have been Tyrians, it followed as a necessity for the commencement of the history of ancient America that we must establish the year in which those Tyrians landed. Still having regard to the antiquity of the ruins, that the migration to the Western Hemisphere was not undertaken by the nation of Tyrus in its days of prosperity was and is conclusively established by the fact that the voyagers never returned to announce the accomplishment of the expedition, as they would have done had they been sent by the king or nation, as in the case of the voyage around Africa. If it had been a national expedition, and they had under that authority discovered the western continent, they must have returned to Tyrus, for the absence of the fair portion of our race would prevent their remaining. Or if they did remain, arguments in reference to descendants could not be advanced, and therefore an useless hypothesis in regard to the present history. Since then, the Tyrians did not reach the western continent during the period of their national prosperity. That faced that fact pointed at once to an era when decay or desolation had the ascendancy, and this did not exist until their last doom and fall, when fire and sword failed the nation. As an island tree to the earth, a few leaves only were rescued by a friendly gale, and thus escaped the conflagration. That last day of Tyrus we distinctly pointed out, and from undisputed history, to have been the 20th of August, 332 years before Christ, which date is not opposed by the character of the ruins or the traditions of the Aborigines, but supported by both. It was then pointed out that the quote remnant unquote saved by the Sidonians could nowhere land upon the shores of the Mediterranean from the natural fear of Alexander's continued vengeance, and that the quote remnant unquote or their descendants cannot be traced in Europe, Asia, or Africa, except upon the Isle of Tenerife, as evidenced by the discovery of the mummies. The identity between them and those in Peru we mentioned formed at once a connecting chain across the Atlantic. Through a deep dive of the genetic testing site of my true ancestry, I have ancestors, ancient ancestors of the Canary Islands, of the Mayans. So reading this, if I go with what the narrative states that slaves were brought to the Canary Islands, if I go with that, even though they're telling me that the ancestors were on that land BC, then it can't be slavery in the essence of the 1500s, 1700s, 1800s slavery. The time span don't match. That's why it's important to do your research. It was then pointed out that the quote remnant saved by the Sidonians could nowhere land upon the shores of the Mediterranean from the natural fear of Alexander's continued vengeance, and the quote remnant unquote or their descendants cannot be traced in Europe, Asia, or Africa, except upon the Isle of Tenerife. No DNA testing was done at the time, meaning no DNA test. No Ancestry.com didn't exist in the 1800s when Greg Jones wrote this book. They were doing archaeological testing of the mummies, but the testing of the humans had not taken place yet. As evidenced by the discovery of the mummies, the identity between them and those in Peru we mentioned formed at once a connecting chain across the Atlantic. So those Peruvians are black. The fortunate owl discovered by their ancestors were their only refuge immediately after the desolation of their country, and being there, the fears of pursuit would naturally possess them. With means furnished by the Sidonians, it was submitted that the freedom was assured to them, for upon leaving the island of the snow-crowned peak, their knowledge of astronomy and the power of the aurors would aid their voyage. But apart from those powerful adjuncts, it was proved that the constant east wind would waft them westward, and with their double rudders lashed amidships, their galleys must, quote, touch at Florida, unquote, on a direct line from Tenerife, and within the changes of a moon. Thence the voyage, could not be of that duration to compel return from the want of the means of sustenance. In the translation of the sculpture of the chief altar at Copan, it was shown that the magic art had portrayed the identical act of friendship leading to the safety of the Tyrians, and their nation is perfectly illustrated by the accessories upon the altar. And having translated the sculpture, we maintained, in humble submission to the opinion of others, that the definition of the hieroglyphics on the surface of the altar was also arrived at, upon the admitted ground of argument that one but illustrated the other. We have reserved a strong conclusion correction. We have reserved a strong conclusive proof of the correctness of the date assigned for the migration until this time. And although not necessary for evidence, yet it will, we believe, not to have its due effect upon the critic. We will illustrate this proof in belief chronological order. List 606 BC, voyage around the continent of Africa by the Tyrians. 585 BC, commencement of the first siege of Tyrus. The mainland capital destroyed in the 13th century and thence became a vassal nation. 515 BC, restoration of Tyrus as a nation after 70 years of vassalage from the beginning of the above siege, according to prophecy. 484 BC, Herodotus wrote his History of Egypt. In it, he mentions the great expedition around Africa in 606 BC by the Tyrians, but the voyage only therefore down to his time, viz. 484 BC. The migration to the Western Hemisphere had not been attempted, and he wrote only 152 years before the Alexandrian siege. 332 BC, siege and destruction of Tyrus by the Macedonian. Arrian makes no allusion to any migration to or knowledge by the Tyrians of a Western continent at any time during the period from Herodotus to the last siege. It is therefore a fair deduction that none took place, nor was it known to that period, viz. 332 BC. But at that siege, upon the authority of the same author, many fugitive families were rescued. During the storming of the capital by the Sidonians. Down then to the period of the siege of 332 BC, no immigration to or discovery of a Western continent was known or recorded, and yet Tyrians are found to have been upon that distant land. Both points we claim at once to be admitted, and will, therefore, instantly establish that the Tyrians landing in America could be no other than those rescued by the Sidonians. And as a necessity, the date is correctly given for commencing the history of ancient America at 332 BC. To sustain this proposition of additional proof, the following brief argument is presented, viz. Upon the annihilation of Canaan, Tyrus, and all its inhabitants found within the walls being either murdered or sent as slaves into Macedonia and other nations. Alexander repopulated the destroyed capital with people from the Grecian countries and speaking the language of the Greeks. That's how they got there. The same was done at Alexandria, and this language was there, and at Grecian Tyrus, continued to, and after the time of the Savior, and it had a material effect in advancing Christianity. For Jerusalem being between Tyrus and Alexandria, and the three capitals having that language as the general medium of writing and conversation, the early doctrines of the Christian church were rapidly promulgated and promoted. After August 20th, then 332 BC, the Greek language only, in complement to and by the command of Alexander, was spoken at Greco-Tyrus. Therefore, will not the critic anticipate as an absolute necessity, admitting of no denial if the Greek Tyrians had left Phoenicia and landed on the western continent after the year 332 BC, and it has been shown that none of the ancient Tyrians reached there before that period. The Greek language would be found upon the altar of Copan, instead of which hieroglyphics are only there, and they being translated by analyzing the story of the attendant sculpture at once unfolded the last incident in the Asiatic history of the Tyrian family, descended from Sidon and the house of Canaan. Actually, I wanted to point out something. The narrative have always been that Cain had did something awful by unaliving Abel. The truth is that God was pleased with Cain because of his burnt offerings. Abel sent up offerings of blood. So there was no jealousy like we've been taught. It was Abel who had did unjust to God. Thus, Canaan or Cain getting the curse, his descendants getting the curse. The Tyrian family descended from Sidon and the house of Canaan. The author restated in commencing the above illustration that this last proof of the correctness of the date was, quote, a strong conclusive, unquote. One, will it not be regarded by the historic reader as absolute and conclusive? If any documents of antiquity could be found written in the Phoenician character and distinctly stating the fact that the Tyrians did migrate to the western continent and in the year specified, no one would doubt that evidence. Well, then, Those documents of the olden time have been found and and read, readable only in the Tyrian language, which is the original Hebrew. All Bibles, when I was a kid, were in Hebrew. By the late 70s, early 80s, the Bibles began to be translated and other versions put out. But it was very difficult to read the Bibles when you went to church because they were in Hebrew. Thus is the time around getting or being called Afro American and African American. All of this happened at the same time. And then your drugs. Then you saw, what is it, musical artists pushing out music that was not harmful. And then it appeared that those artists were no longer making the music. And then we saw a change in movies and music, not to mention the influx of substances. If any documents of antiquity could be found, written in the Phoenician character and distinctly stating the fact that the Tyrians did migrate to the western continent, and in the year specified, no one would doubt that evidence. Well, then, those documents of the olden time have been found and readable only in the Tyrian language. They are to be seen at this day upon the walls and altars in ancient America. All of those pyramids and writings are all through North America, South America, and Central America. Architecture and sculpture were the true historians in old time. The twin born with creation has been the faithful keeper of the archives and which unfold undeniable truths of prophesied religion. No one should be hurting or trying to harm any brown person or black person. And finally, we brought forward for reflection, solemn consideration, five branches of a great and dormant prophecy, yet each within itself a prophecy, and how truly they have been fulfilled. The previous arguments we shall dare believe, and the historic facts have illustrated and established. If then these Tyrian prophecies are admitted to be correctly applied, and the proof of the last one being identified as having been fulfilled in ancient America, then as a necessity, the conclusion is that the seal of the prophet is placed forever upon the truth of this branch of the present history. An additional claim we now with confidence advance for receiving an acquiescence in the entire work and as a necessity in this portion of it, This that the first prediction in the Bible concerning the human family, together with the malediction of Noah upon a branch of it, are being proved to have been fulfilled by the Tyrian and Israelitish identity in the Western Hemisphere, and their conquerors being of the Spanish and Anglo-Saxon race. Therefore, the last words of the Diluvian patriarch sustain the present summary of our evidence. This interesting discovery will be enlarged upon in the following and concluding chapter, devoted to the refutation of atheistical denials of the truth of sacred prophecy. In the belief from the quote foregone conclusions unquote that the first epoch of the Western Hemisphere, identifying the southern division of it as Tyrian America, will be received a verdict in the affirmative. We shall proceed with the other branches of our cause, viz., Israel and Christianity, with renewed energy arising from the same firm conviction of their truth. The commencement of the annals of ancient America will consequently be dated from the last siege of Canaan Tyrus by Alexander of Macedon, 332 BC. That will conclude the reading of chapters 13 and 14. Please join me for the last chapter of the reading of the history of ancient America anterior to the time of Columbus by Greg Jones.